Hey guys, it's Judy from Nutrition with Judy. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Judy Cho, and I am board certified in holistic nutrition. I help people get to root cause healing, and oftentimes that starts with a meat-only elimination diet for gut healing. Okay, so I'm excited. Today, I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Ritchie Shoemaker. We talked a lot about chronic inflammatory response syndrome. This interview gets pretty technical, so if you haven't checked out my intro to CIRS, I highly recommend checking that video first. I will put that in the show note. Dr. Shoemaker is the founder of the Chronic Inflammatory Response Syndrome, and he can tell you a lot about it more in our interview. He is a practicing physician, and now he works towards getting doctors and practitioners certified in his CIRS protocol. Everything he shares is evidence-based. There is the scientific approach to everything he does, and it's very well laid out, and the material is so profound, and it's very, very easy to follow once you get past a lot of the acronyms. If you are not able to figure out why you are not getting better fully on a meat-only diet, I highly recommend listening to this interview and then going back and looking into this CIRS protocol more. All right, let's get right into this discussion. Hi, Dr. Shoemaker. Thank you so much for joining me today. I've been doing so much research into your work and a lot of the information you've put out there and for free. So thank you so much for all the work you've contributed to the wellness space. I'm so excited for my community to learn about you. If you don't mind introducing yourself to those that are listening and watching.
My name is Ritchie Shoemaker. I am a family practitioner by trade. I started my practice in National Health Service Corps in Pocomoke, Maryland, between the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean, in a medically served area, and I've been here ever since. I love it. My life changed from being an outpatient rural family practice physician in 1996 when there was an outbreak of a mysterious illness that first affected fish and caused lesions and sores on fish and killed fish, but then started making the watermen sick. Watermen are people that harvest fish. Mm-hmm. And who had ever seen this illness before? They didn't even have a name for it. Ominous tones coming from North Carolina that Pfiesteria, a dinoflagellates, it's like an algae, was active that had never been known to be active before. As it turns out, Pfiesteria has been in the Chesapeake Bay since at least the 1900s, and it's been making people sick for a very long period of time. But it wasn't until there were environmental disturbances, not nutrients, no, that's what they said, but it was actually fungicides, of all things, that altered the life cycle of this organism, that pushed it from being benign, feeding along the bottom of the rivers, into being aggressive, with looking for a mate. So feeding and breeding in the motile phase, that's when the organism made a toxin, which is a pheromone to attract other Pfiesterias in the place. What would have happened is if you had exposure to water or water droplets where there was active blooms of Pfiesteria, you could acquire a toxin-mediated illness, the first one like this recorded in U.S. history.
And then how did that start being affecting people, and how did you start seeing it in your practice?
Well, these are my friends. These are people I saw in Walmart. And they look at me and say, how come you can't figure this out? What's wrong with you? And so I started doing everything I was trained to do. My education at Duke University I thought was pretty good, but I couldn't find any clues. And medications that I used, guessed, didn't work and didn't give up. There's something about this illness. It was very strange. And coincidentally, maybe by being in the right place at the right time, a young lady came in who had horrible secretory diarrhea. And remember, secretory diarrhea is that kind of diarrhea you get when you haven't had anything to eat. It just happens. So it means it's a disease of the skin, of the bowel itself. Well, good old family practice docs, especially rural docs, know all about cholestyramine. It's a constipating agent. It's great for stopping secretory diarrhea. So what would you do? I bet you'd give somebody cholestyramine. That's what I did. And lo and behold, the diarrhea went away. Well, what a surprise. What a surprise. But the memory came back, and the cough stopped, the muscle aches stopped, and the neurologic things, and the brain started working. What in the world? How could an unabsorbed anion binding resin called a cholesterol drug actually make all this difference and strange symptoms that we had no physiology. We had no clue. But armed with the fact I can make people better, at the end, that's some of what people wanted, was to feel better. But I wanted to know what went on. And I spent the next 25 years of my life trying to unravel the puzzles. And we've gotten all the way to actinomycetes, which I hope we'll talk about today.
Okay. Talking a little bit about CIRS, or this chronic inflammatory response syndrome, you mentioned like molecular hypometabolism, the Warburg effect, and even how our bodies process different macronutrients. Can you talk about, just taking a step back, how does basically these biotoxins that we are either getting from fish, from water, damaged buildings, how does it impact the inflammatory response in our systems?
The focus from 1997 on was on inflammation. Mm-hmm. The blood tests, the proteomics we used were all proteins having to do with inflammation. It wasn't until 2015 where Jimmy Ryan comes into play. Dr. Ryan is a molecular biologist, a transcriptomist. He looks at differential gene activation as part of his daily life. He published a paper with me, and we've been doing this since 2011, but by 2015, we published a paper on Ciguatera because we felt if we took an explosive finding that Dr. Ryan had of changes in molecular biology caused by exposure to these biotoxins, if we started right out with water damaged buildings, that's going to be too controversial on its own end, and who would listen to more controversy? So we chose Ciguatera that nobody's ever heard of, and yet it has all the parameters that go with a biotoxic illness: exposure followed by inflammatory changes. But then we saw changes in differential gene activation, and wow, was that a big deal? Holy cow! Right now, if you think about transcriptomics, you're thinking about maybe vascular disease and cancer. Well, we're not thinking about chronic fatigue illnesses. There's been a few other people doing real work like we're doing, but by looking at the mechanisms of changes in messenger RNA, sounds like COVID might have something to do with this, doesn't it? Well, it does. But specifically, we added the metabolic and the nutritional aspects to the inflammation, which was a missing link. It wasn't until 2021 that the metabolism paper was published, looking at metabolic complications associated with and related to development of inflammation followed by exposure. And we now know that some of these little small molecular compounds affect production of protein by ribosomes. Ribosomes are one of the organelles inside of a cell. There's a million of them. They do a lot of good things, but they will be a source of attachment of the code, 3 amino acids, for a protein. So initiation of protein synthesis, followed by adding an amino acid for each codon, 3 amino acids, three genes for one amino acid. We elongate the protein until we're ready to terminate it, and then termination comes. So this mechanism sounds disarmingly simple, and yet there is, between the large and small ribosomal subunits, a structure called the sarsen-ricin loop. Now, Judy, I'm sure you've heard of the sarsen-ricin loop. The ricin poison is a plant toxin. Most people have heard of that. But this is an evolutionarily conserved structure that has a nucleoside 15, an adenosine moiety that can be removed by a ribotoxin, these very small molecular weight things, and poison ribosomes. In the worst case, the poisoning can cause death, but we know that this poisoning can also be initiated by bacteria. There are 6,000 organisms identified in the literature that have a toxin antitoxin system. So they can slow down the host cell or their cell at will and then start it back up. So this is a survival mechanism. And it's fascinating. The more you get into it, how can such a structure that walnut trees have and chimpanzees have and parameciums have, they're all the same. My goodness, look at all the metabolic pathways we have, the nutritional pathways. They're all the same. Evolutionary conservation, we are looking at a fundamental disruption of biology. And to make it worse, we have ribosomes in mitochondria. And I've heard a lot of noise, pardon my French, about mitochondrial function. And most people don't realize that of the 1,000 genes that started out to be mitochondrial, there's only 37 left in the mitochondria. The rest have migrated to the nucleus, where they're called nuclear encoded mitochondrial genes. And there they're subject to regulation by transcription factors. So here we have biotoxins, ribotoxins, controlling protein synthesis, and we also have mechanisms to control energy production by mitochondria. Now, it gets worse than that because there are specific conserved moieties that are produced by these little tiny organisms, and the worst ones are fungi. Mycotoxins have a reputation for causing the problem, but they don't deserve it. Deserve it is actinobacteria or actinomycetes. These organisms are filamentous bacteria, and there's thousands of them. They are the biggest genus of all in bacteria. They make 20,000 different compounds. And if you want an antibiotic, ask actinobacteria to make it for you. They will. If you want to disrupt metabolism and knock out in the mitochondrial matrix, complex 1, well, make some pyrosidin A. But actinobacteria will do that, which will knock out ATP production. How about oligomycin, another compound knocking out complex 3, another one of the mitochondrial functions? How about giving somebody a valinomycin, which is a mitochondrial toxin that blocks the entry of pyruvate from the cytoplasm across the outer mitochondrial membrane to get into the mitochondrial matrix, and there it can be made into energy ATP with ATPases or cyclooxygenase, the electron transport chain. But what if that opening, that pore, that voltage-dependent anion channel is closed by valinomycin? What if it's closed by tubulin A4A or tubulin BB1? Will there be pyruvate delivery to the inside of the mitochondria? No.
You know what's
the pyruvate going to do?
As practitioners, we think that it's the diet and we are eating the wrong foods that are causing us to have low energy. But a lot of times it can be at this molecular level that we are not even looking at. So part of the thing that I looked at with CIRS is that as a root cause, it could be a chronic inflammatory response syndrome, but we are looking as practitioners on about the gut or adrenal dysfunction or some imbalance, but really it's a more deeper root cause like chronic inflammatory response syndrome. And I just really wanted to dive into that of how people can get affected by some type of biotoxin, and maybe we can define that. And then how that then starts affecting our symptoms, and how even if we have like a genetic haplotype, that we are more susceptible to these, I guess, exposures and toxins.
There are over 420 known small molecular weight compounds that disrupt protein synthesis and mitochondrial function. So technically, there's a lot of biotoxins, and
right.
Many are made by organisms like actinos. Many are made by mycotoxins, but dinoflagellates can make them, spirochetes can make them, apicomplexans can make them. It turns out they're one of the most common sources of cell-to-cell interaction that there is. Now, if we look at a CIRS, a chronic inflammatory response syndrome, acquired following most commonly exposure to the interior environment of a water-damaged building that has water intrusion, followed by absence of dry out over 48 hours, in which there will be accelerated growth or accentuated growth of fungi, actinobacteria, of which mycobacteria are one, regular gram-negative rods, gram-positive cocci are also a part, including inflammagens made by including hemolysins, spirocyclic drymanes, and the list goes on. These illnesses cause a multi-system, multi-symptom illness that has at least 25 separate published peer-reviewed biomarkers that define the illness, as opposed to chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia or deconditioning, where we don't have any biomarkers, even after all these years. With CIRS, we do. So that if we look at a biotoxin, it is a compound made by a living creature That means there's going to be DNA transcription to get to the biotoxin production, whether it's a fungus or an actinobacteria or not. But specifically, what we're looking at is that a mold is not a biotoxin. Molds can make biotoxins.
Right.
Molds cannot make biotoxins as well. There must be an environmental signal for the mold to change. Now, the most common signal is production of peroxidases by plants to prevent molds from predating on plants. So this idea that biotoxins are defensive agents is wrong-headed. That's just not the way it is. These compounds are very expensive to make molecularly. They're energy rich, they're energy dense, and they take a long time to be made. So they're not made frivolously. And so as far as biowarfare, no. But are they a natural selection item? Yes. So is this fascinating in how the complexity keeps on going? Yes. Now, I did want to caution you in some of your questions, and I was very pleased with your questions. Good job. You were focusing a little more than I thought indicated on adrenal function. And we can hopefully get to that. As far as thyroid problems, no. Hashimoto's has nothing to do with this, and hypothyroidism has nothing to do with this. It's a common assumption that people make, but the data just don't support that. When we're looking at how blood handles sugar, we're really looking at the second phase, and that's the metabolic phase. If we look at the metabolic complications that come along with CIRS, you're going to find them. And one of the first things we find is a widened anion gap. Now, in your patient clientele, do you measure a comprehensive metabolic profile? Of course you do. So you measure an anion gap every time you see a patient. Have you noticed what the anion gaps usually are in CIRS? They're widened. More than 12, probably 20, 22 along the way. And this widening of the anion gap comes from excessive production of lactic acid. Because remember, my tantalizing question for you, which you were nodding your answer and you already knew, about what happens to pyruvate. If it can't be metabolized by mitochondria, it'll be broken down into lactic acid and exported against the gradient and sent outside the cell. So you only get 2 ATP, but you get extra metabolic production of acids. And metabolic acidosis leads to additional complications, and we published this in 2021, reduction of T regulatory cell receptors, really bad things happening, autoimmunity, oh my, Treg cells, here we go. How about inflammation in tissue? Yep, there you go. Pulmonary hypertension comes directly out of metabolic acidosis. And how many people have you ordered a stress echo in recently because they're dyspneic or short of breath, or you thought they might have coronary disease? If your answer isn't 10 last week, you weren't busy enough. You missed them. But specifically, this is a very new element, but the big deal, and here's where the real issue comes, is the brain injury. You can have increased numbers of gray matter nuclear atrophy. You can have atrophy of cortical gray. You can have enlargement of inferior lateral and then superior lateral ventricle. Now, you were focusing on hippocampus. Do you know the main source of absence of restorative protein production by a hippocampus that's under siege? Where that comes from? Anisomycin.
Okay.
All right, and what is anisomycin? It's a biotoxin made by actinobacteria. So all these folks looking at Alzheimer's disease, thinking about hippocampus, and in your questions, do you have some of that? Really, we should be asking is there anisomycin, which we can show, present in these people? Because actinobacteria on the skin are able to release compounds through what we call extracellular vesicles to carry toxins, DNA, RNA, from the skin, the deep pore parenchyma of the skin, sweat glands, oil glands, into vesicles that then get distributed through the body and create an endogenous inflammatory event. Now, how about that? We've gotten from needed exposure being outside the skin to now exposure inside the skin. Fascinating.
Let me take a step back. So let's say I get a client exposed to water damage building or some type of maybe mycotoxin from possible mold. And so let's say then they have maybe one of the genetic haplotypes that you mentioned where the switch off from the innate immune system to the adaptive is not as seamless. And so then their genetic portion of this gets activated. And now they're in this kind of chronic inflammatory state where the inflammation is on because of a biotoxin exposure, but they are not getting better. And so as they're constantly in this cycle of inflammation, the brain starts, in a very simplistic term, starts to get on fire. So the hippocampus, the cortisol within the brain starts lighting up, and essentially the body's in full inflammation. And then so one of the hormones in that whole process is the melanocyte stimulating hormone, or the MSH, will start decreasing so that the brain won't be as inflamed. And then once that starts happening, physical issues start happening related to the gut, related to adrenal function. If I'm not feeling well, how do I know that it's chronic inflammatory response syndrome? And how do I get better? What are the steps through that all to understand that maybe my case of not getting better is not necessarily that my dietary parts need to change, but rather it's stemming from the brain?
I want to go back to this question about brain on fire.
Okay.
There's a wonderful poem by Carl Sandburg. Some say the world will die in fire. Some say it'll die in ice. Ice is nice. And I butchered the poem, but I want to hesitate to call this on fire.
Okay.
Inflammation makes you think on fire.
Yes.
But when you have metabolic injury and you have metabolic acidosis and you have failure of ability to make ATP, the problem is not on fire, it's on ice.
Okay, fair enough. Right.
Think about a sodium potassium pump in the brain and there's no fuel to fill it. Is that on fire or is it slowed down?
Sure.
It's slowed down, it's diminished. You can't reset the neurons. So what happens to the neurons in nuclei is they start to dry up, they die. And then we start getting brain fog. Brain injury is found in 95% of patients with CIRS. But specifically, all the elements that you mentioned was almost a rehash. The very first biomarker was HLA, the immune response genes indicator. My question was, how come of the 10 people who got of the 7 people who got Pfiesteria in a group of 10 swimming at Williams Point in 1996, how come 7 got sick and 3 didn't? Well, if you're on the Eastern Shore, you know somebody was smoking. You know somebody was drinking. You know somebody was not taking care of himself. This is the Eastern Shore. We have a good time here. But what was it? Was it diabetes? Was it family history? What was it? It was HLA, immune response genes involved in antigen presentation. My God, you could have a toxin that you're exposed to and you couldn't make an immune response to it. Now, you mentioned adaptive immunity. That means there's an antibody made. But if you have an antigen-presenting cell or a dendritic cell, it will take a receptor bound to a toxin and it'll internalize it with an HLA marker, process it, and send it to the other side of the cell, figuratively, and present it to a naive T cell that says, okay, take this nice tasty morsel and show it to a B cell and make an antibody. When a naive T cell says, sorry, you don't have the password. You can't log in. What do you mean I can't log in? I can't do the show. Okay, where's the login? Defective antigen presentation is a characteristic, and you should not be surprised the questions that we get about COVID shots. Will I get a COVID shot if I have defective antibody? How about if I got multiple myeloma? Will I have defective antigen presentation? Oh, yeah. We can go on that for another show. But specifically, what we're looking at is that there are changes in regulation of inflammation, and the inflammatory response lowers MSH. MSH is a regulatory neuropeptide made most commonly in the hypothalamus, communicating through the portal system with the pituitary. But once you lose MSH, in one of your questions, you almost never remake it. It is that bad. So these illnesses can be chronic. We don't use a cure word unless MSH or a substitute, VIP, is used to make the correction. There are other peptides that are being used, don't all have the same track record. You can't assume that BPC is going to work or thymosin 1 delta is going to work. You cannot make that assumption. You need the data. You do the experiment. Don't guess. Whatever you do, don't guess. But specifically, we talked about HLA and MSH. You had a question. Go ahead.
Your protocol and all the research you've done is very, very backed by science, and it's very easy to follow. So everyone that goes through your certification program, there's all these steps prior to diagnosing someone with CIRS, and then how they can, I guess, go through these goalposts of are they getting better after, for example, the cholesterol. I'll tell you a little bit about my practice. So I work with a lot of clients that have hormonal issues, lost your period, just unwell, doing every single diet, eating the cleanest foods. So then they work with me and they do a meat only elimination diet just to get to basics of, is it a plant toxin? Is it anti-nutrients, something like gluten or lectins? And for a lot of people, that is the enough of a change so that they start feeling better. But then I have a population of people that no matter what I do, sure, we get the gut better. They do a stool test and their markers look better. But then they start getting sick again. And there's just a population of people that no matter how clean the meat is, no matter how much variety of meats and nutrient density they eat, they're not fully better. And so then I stumbled upon your work and I got a few people to do the CIRS testing. So the MMP9, the MSH TGF-Beta one, and then
time out before you go too far. What you are describing is one of the lectures I gave years ago in Pittsburgh on the difference between hygeia and panacea. You are advocating hygienic measures of clean food and exercise and perhaps some meditation and good thoughts and all that. And I'm going to look and say, that's fine. That'll help you feel better if you don't have an inflammatory or metabolic disease, because there you need panacea. And I went into Asclepius and it was great fun. I think I was the only person who enjoyed the lecture, but specifically the issue is that hygeia is not the goddess to fix CIRS. Panacea, her sister, is. Isolde, the mother, kept those very separate. But specifically, you are going through the different parameters, and when people certify, they will make sure that they can write an essay of what is the Shoemaker protocol accurately, correctly in the English language. And that's what you see. It's not their protocol, quite frankly. It's the surviving mold protocol. And there are folks that argue with me, says, I have no need for a protocol. I individualize everything. I said, well, you never will have a protocol then to fix 4 million people. And that's the critical issue. This is a common illness. We see it with 95% likelihood, the same things present all the time. It's reproducible, reliable. Therefore, people who are in South Africa or in the UK or in Australia or in Kansas can use the same protocol that you're talking about today with the same expected success rates. Now, success rates, that was another one of your good questions. Well, what are we going to do? If you have defined the illness, it meets the case definition. A case definition was encoded by the USGAO in 2008. My case definition from 2003 kind of went bye-bye. But when the government says, this is what the illness is, exposure to water damage building potential. Symptoms the same as seen in published peer-reviewed literature. Labs the same as seen in published peer-reviewed literature. And responsive objective parameters, not subjective parameters, objective parameters. Right. We want to have things that are going to be the same from a lab in Brisbane like they are in Kansas City. And so the whole key issue is that reproducibly reliable biomarkers, and then we haven't even talked about the brain and neurocon, but I'll let you go on. You're doing a great job.
There were some clients that I've worked with long enough now where as I learned more about your protocol, I had some people test and they all tested positive. So some of them have the haplotypes, some of them have just the mold specific one. I used your I guess the
Rosetta Stone, yay.
Yeah, the Rosetta Stone, thank you.
And no substitutes. Use the Rosetta Stone. You see what happens on the internet. Oh my God.
And they have all the markers you indicated. So low MSH, high TGF-Beta 1, high MMP9. And then they have all the symptomology. They failed the VCS test. And for these people, diet wasn't enough, like you said, and lifestyle, and they did all this work. And we need to basically get to the root cause of lowering the inflammation in the brain and just the overactive immune response. And that's where I think your protocol is so powerful. And so my guess is within the population of people that are trying to do a meat-only diet and an elimination diet to get better, my guess is the CIRS population, I know from the content I've read of yours that it may affect 24% or maybe 40 million, but I think within the carnivore meat-only community, my guess it's a lot higher just because, again, people are willing to do meat only to feel better. And initially, a lot of them do because they remove certain foods, but over time, their symptoms start coming back. And that's when I wonder how many people are actually suffering from chronic inflammatory response syndrome.
Let's add a couple more biomarkers. We started talking a little bit about the Warburg effect and production of lactic acid from pyruvate. If we have another compound, insulin receptor substrate 2, this is a compound that has many downstream effects. So AKT and mTOR all have a lot to do with IRS2. But IRS2 opens GLUT1 and GLUT4, the pathways that let glucose come into the cell.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have this increase in IRS2, you'll have an increase in openings to let in sugar.
Okay.
And if you let in extra sugar, whether it's a meat-based diet or not, you're going to be getting more carbohydrate having an effect because glycolysis will be activated. GAPDH is one of the genes that we look at, and insulin resistance what we look at. And what we're trying to say is, what happens if we open the gates of hell, that being GLUT1 and GLUT4, flood the cell with glucose, which will be broken down to pyruvate if GAPDH is doing fine. Mm-hmm. If we're not looking at this by the biosynthetic pathway, creating proliferative physiology, we will induce the metabolic complications that go with inflammation. And inflammation feeds on metabolism. Metabolism feeds on inflammation. I can't tell now which comes first, chickens, eggs. Well, let's see, chickens are meat-based, eggs are not. But the issue is that if we go one way with nutrition and ignore IRS2 and ignore proliferative physiology, we're ignoring the whole reason that people stay physically ill because they don't make protein the way they should. They don't metabolize glucose the way they should. And if we don't fix that, we don't fix the patient.
Yes, I agree. So maybe we can touch upon, if I feel that that's me and I'm listening to this and watching this and I feel maybe I'm suffering from CIRS, where do I get started? Do I start doing the vision test? Do I get my blood work tested? Do I do some of the imaging you were mentioning? How should I get started if I think that I may be suffering from CIRS?
The answer is simple. Do you meet the case definition? If you don't meet the case definition, don't waste your time. But if you do meet the case definition, then go out full blast. Now, the difference now compared to 2014 mm-hmm. is that we can use gene activation as a single test called Genie. We've done over nearly 2,000 of these. We can stratify symptoms by objective parameters of gene activation. We can manipulate gene activation to manipulate disease. Isn't that fascinating? Wow. People dreamed about that back in 2002, 2003 when they're doing the Human Genome Project. Wouldn't it be nice if you could control gene activation? Well, we can, and we do. And this is the whole mechanism. If you start stratifying by stage of Genie, you know what the next steps are. Don't go to VIP, step 3,
right,
till you finish step 2, which is the 11 steps of my protocol. And certainly, if you don't have molecular hypermetabolism, which Genie will show, then maybe you should be thinking of Th17 Treg imbalance, which looks like CIRS, but it's not CIRS. Genie will tell you that same reason yourself. But we can come up with an array to say, is my problem mycotoxins? 7% of CIRS patients will have that, 7%, not 70, 7. Mm-hmm. Is it endotoxins? 28% will have endotoxin. These are from gram-negative rods. And 42% will have actinobacteria. We used to call them actinomycetes, now we call them actinobacteria. Some will have both because numbers don't add up to 100%. But specifically, we're looking at how can you tell if you're exposed. Well, fortunately, we have a couple labs. Mycometrics in New Jersey will do some of the tests. EnviroBiomics, and I have no relation to any of these labs. There's no conflict of interest. EnviroBiomics in San Antonio is more complete because they've been kind of catering to this population. But specifically, if you want to know if you've got actinobacteria, you can find actinobacteria in dust. Mm-hmm. So what I would do, if you meet the case definition and your visual contrast sensitivity is positive, those symptoms rosters will have 8 of 13 clusters and VCS. You have a 98.5% chance of having a CIRS. That's adding false positive and adding false negative to get 1.5%. So this is incredibly accurate, but it doesn't tell you the mechanism that the illness comes. The next step is the mechanism of the illness. That's where you would do a dust collection looking for filamentous fungi, molds, That's where you'd be looking for filamentous bacteria, actinobacteria. That's when you're looking for gram-negative rods. And these organisms are going to be found in different ecological situations. So we want to know what's there. Next, we want to know what's the water content of the environment, because the activity of water gives us this number. It's graded up to 100%. If you're 90 to 100%, that's why you find water-loving fungi and actinos and endotoxins. If you're 80 to 90, they're less water-loving, but actinos are there, but you don't find endos. And then you've got the dry organisms, the xerophilic, XCRO philic. They're going to be 55 to 65 to 70%. There you won't find filamentous bacteria very often. You will find actinos, but you won't find endotoxins. So what we've done in 2 paragraphs is we've defined the case definition. We've defined a marker that's biologically reliable, that's been reproducibly published around the world. We've defined the habitat and the ecology of what are you up against. Your work is almost done, because now you just need to clear out the ecology, because removal from exposure, and you need to stop the circulation of ongoing biotoxins that are going to be going from gut to blood, gut to blood, gut to blood, out through the liver, back into the gut. And then you're going to finally show that BCS is the first marker, together with the 11 steps you need to do, that says that I'm better and then I'm cured. How about that?
Yeah, I mean, it seems so promising. And one of the questions was why don't most people just know about this and treat this way? I know a lot of people are incorrectly diagnosed with MS sometimes, when it can actually be a CIRS issue.
Right. The risk of cynicism and the risk of throwing rocks at other people goes through the roof when someone says, how come people don't read? Well, the issue is that when you have 15 minutes or 10 minutes, and you've got 40 people to see in a day, and then you've got the insurance paperwork to do, and you're going to get paid less than what you wanted to get paid. What time is there for learned providers to read new things? Because remember, it wasn't until 1985 that TNF was first identified, and it wasn't until 1995 that TGF-Beta 1 was identified. This is a relatively new illness with new biomarkers. And heaven forbid that the 5 minutes of teaching that I got in medical school on actinomycetes of lumpy, bumpy jaw and sulfur granules would actually be saying that these compounds, or these organisms, make little conveyors that are extracellular vesicles. Who even knew that gram-positive organisms made extracellular vesicles until 1998? So, I mean, a lot of this is because it's new.
Right.
Cynically, it's because it takes too much time. I can tell you jokes, but where do you hide the $100 bill from the internist? Yeah, okay. But there also has been some institutional play. The federal government has kind of end all and be all, like I told you, the 2008 USGAO case definition trumped mine. Well, what did the CDC do? Nothing of the sort. CDC said nothing at all. It might be an allergy. Maybe it's a psychological thing. If you go to England, it's psychological. But at the same time, here are the data published and peer-reviewed. We have 45 papers published, 14 books published, treated thousands of patients. How come people aren't listening? Well, in one deposition, when I did legal testimony, I was called the most dangerous man in America. Because if people listened to me, I would not be putting up with unsafe homes. There was an article yesterday about this historically Black universities and colleges. And Howard University had people sleeping in tents outside their dorms because their dorms were so bad. University of North Carolina had the same problem 2 weeks ago. Stacy dorm, where I went in high school for a course to take, was moldy as can be. I didn't know anything about it. But you're going to find 50+% of inhabited buildings in the U.S. are water damaged. And if 45% of those people, of those buildings make people sick, that's a real big number. So 40 million that you mentioned, that is an underestimate of who is sickened with a treatable illness. Come on, people, read. It's all published. Everything I do is published and peer reviewed. I'm not making up, Eye of Newt and bubble, toil, and trouble, This is all good science. It's all published.
Of the testing that I've done on my clients, there was one person that had the MARCoNS in the nose, but and had high the TGF-Beta one and the low MSH, but they didn't have any of the haplotypes.
It is a marker of susceptibility,
Okay.
not a guarantee of illness.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
95% of people will follow the Rosetta Stone protocols. But if I've got a 15651 with a MS susceptibility and Lyme susceptibility, they can get sickened if MSH is low just by itself. Or they can get sickened if they develop molecular hypometabolism. This holy grail, I'm telling you, the genes is where the action is, or where it's at, baby. The issue is that we now know that HLA is a good guidepost, and it's wonderful for doing family planning. For example, if a mom is 4353 and dad's 11352B, well, 50-50 chance that each one of their children is going to have one or the other, or another percentage chance is going to have both. So do you want to breed? Interestingly, of the people that get divorced, lack of coherence of HLA markers is the most common predictor. 70% of people that don't have the same HLA get divorced. 70%.
That is
of the
so
people that share HLA, less than 25% get divorced. Just for your fun and education today.
So can you talk a little bit about how these markers being imbalanced, having CIRS affects our gut, and why leaky gut is not just because of some diet that you're following that's not ideal, like let's say eating too much gluten, for example, and also how even our endocrine system can be affected by like the MSH being really low.
Let's take the gut first.
Okay.
James Lipton and Anna Catania published back in the 90s on the investment of MSH in intracellular junctions and creating tight junctions.
Right.
So when you listen to people with celiac disease, that's a problem that they have from gluten, and TTG IgA is a good measurement and a biopsy is a good measurement. But you can have TTG IgA like problems with anti-gliadin antibodies. Right. And there the tight junctions are loosened, MSH is deficient, not sealing up the junctions. Gliadin, an 18 amino acid peptide, can be absorbed through the tight junctions, and then an autoimmune problem results. We see the same kind of problem with anticardiolipins, especially people with long, slender arms and slender faces and long fingers, the models, the basketball players, the volleyball players of the world. But specifically, those body habituses are associated with HLA and TGF-Beta 1 and autoimmunity. They're going to have the gut problems. Now, as far as MSH in the brain, MSH has a lot to do with antidiuretic hormone, or copeptin, as it's now called when you want to order the test, and will affect adversely the relationships of osmolality and NADH. Now, I mentioned earlier about ACTH and cortisol. That's a big deal. We published one of the slides in the training program, and you'll see it. There's 1,300 patients, and they're basically divided into four groups. They all have dysregulation of ACTH and cortisol, either too high for each, too low for each, or one's too high, one's too low. And it's separated. So you can't say that it's cortisol when it's ACTH. It's the relationship. So dysregulation of those pairs. We also see the same problem when people are looking at androgens, because many times people will say, well, my testosterone is low, I'll take some testosterone. Yeah. What they do, if they have an upregulated aromatase because of deficiency of MSH, they will take that DHEAS or that testosterone, convert it over very quickly to estrone or estradiol. In fact, that's one of the diagnostic tests we use, is to give people DHEAS, 25 milligrams 3 times a day for a week, and measure baseline estrone, baseline estradiol, baseline DES, and baseline testosterone, and see what they like in a week. If they're aromatizers, the female hormones will go up, male hormones will go down. But then the guy comes back in to see Dr. Joe and says, I got better for 3 days with my testosterone. Now I'm no better. Give me some more testosterone. Dr. Joe says, here you are. And guess what happens? More estrone, more estradiol. It's crazy. Everything we've done is cases versus control. Okay. It's all statistics. And what we did when we did that diagnostic test for DHEA, look to see what do happen with MSH, what happens with normal MSH. And there are people with normal MSH. We saw that the problems were all low MSH related.
That's so fascinating. You also
Just do the
recommend
test. Do the experiment. Do the experiment. That's all you got to do.
Okay. Well, I can't prescribe, and I'm not a big fan of prescribing hormones, but I don't prescribe DHEA. Well, I guess I could, but I normally don't. But that is interesting. I never thought about that.
IRS2 goes up with glucose. Much of protein, gluconeogenesis is coming. Glucose is driven by protein. So your high protein diets can be high glucose diets.
Yeah.
If you've got IRS2, then you're going to have problems with metabolic acidosis. This problem of the metabolism, the complications will cause your meat eaters to not do well. What you can do, or someone you work with can do, is to do a variation looking to see for your anion gap person. The person I talked to earlier today had an anion gap of 13, a little up, not all that bad. But what you do is you give them a container of glucola like we used to use for glucose tolerance tests, and you measure comprehensive metabolic profile at baseline with a anion gap at time 0, time at 60 minutes, and time at 120 minutes. You will see these people, when you give them the slug of glucose, they will extend their anion gap at 2 hours, and it's diagnostic. You know that they are compensated metabolic acidosis patients, but they're going to be at risk for pulmonary hypertension, Treg deficiency, and then also gray matter nuclear atrophy, just from glucola.
That is so fascinating. And you said the other test was the IRS2?
Yeah, don't leave home without it. You can't do nutrition this day and age without knowing about glycogen and Warburg profile.
Right. What about the MARCoNS in our noses?
If you've got MSH deficiency,
yes,
80% of those patients will have MARCoNS. Now, MARCoNS does most of its damage by its ability to take genetic material from other organisms. It's called horizontal gene transfer. Every microbe does it. And MARCoNS are especially prolific at breeding with other microbes, whether it's a fungus, which is why antifungals are so bad,
right, or
it's a bacteria, or it's a dinoflagellate. Those DNA pieces can be changed. If you get a piece of DNA from an actinobacteria, you will have polycyclic ether toxins. Blenomycin, monensin, monogericin, they're all polycyclic ethers. That's where they come from. That's where MARCoNS causes this biggest problem. So if you want to profile MARCoNS, is it trouble or not, make sure and measure mitoribosomes, large and small. If they're normal, you can forget MARCoNS.
If a client goes through the whole protocol, if someone is clearing even with the VIP nasal spray in the end and all their markers start regulating, if they get exposed again to a toxin, do they have to go through that whole process over?
Unfortunately, within 2 days of re-exposure, we call this a relapse patient, you will have recurrence of IRS2 elevation and hypometabolism. So you are back to square one. No, you will catch it quick enough so that you won't be looking at antigen problems. You won't be having ADH problems. You'll be not worried about gliad and antibodies. You'll see it quickly enough that you'll be able to take action and with well call, and then skip and quickly to VIP. So it is the smart person who learns their exposures are the big deal. The people that don't get better usually aren't taking their medications right. They're usually taking supplements like curcumin that interrupt the VDAC. Bad idea. I see it all the time. And you can't assume a supplement's going to be good for you just because it's being used. But then the other thing is that there is ongoing re-exposure. We had an attorney, 39-year-old, very wealthy attorney from Louisiana, this morning would not get actinotesting done, and yet he's got 6 gray matter nuclear atrophy. What is his problem, actinos? What is his problem? He's stubborn.
I have clients that, fall into all of this right now, and they're very excited to start the cholestyramine and then and then do all of it. But they're always worried. So for the rest of my life, do I have to go wear a mask into these mold buildings? How do I know?
You just know that when you get on an airplane, airplanes are moldy. All that air turnover they say they're supposed to get at 40,000 feet, they don't do it. It costs too much money to do it. You know that you're going to get exposed in the hotel when you land from the airplane. You know full well when you go to the antique shop, you're going to be exposed to mold. You know when you can smell mold, it's not mold, it's actinobacteria. That's all right. You know that if you see it, it's probably going to be something bad. But specifically, when you find water intrusion, that's the bottom denominator. And most people who are like me, I've had this illness for 25 years, it's boring. let's go see a movie, honey. No, what's on Netflix? Let's go shopping in St. Michael's. No, let's go out on the boat, in a rowboat. Let's go out on the paddle boat. Let's go out and do something boring without indoor exposure.
So can someone with a haplotype, and obviously certain haplotypes have a more susceptibility, but can they have a normal immune response if you regulated,
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely, absolutely. If it's like poison ivy. You don't get it if you don't touch it. You can't get it by looking at it.
Right. But then if you just said that 50% of the indoor buildings are infected.
And you breathe the air, that means you inside the building. What did you do that for?
But real life, you have to go in the building. So, can people take that, the Wilco for a preventative measure then?
Absolutely. They sure do too. And it works.
Oh, okay.
And the other thing, training folks to recognize when is a multi-system, multi-symptom illness that develops all at one time over 2 to 3 days, CIRS, about 99% of the time.
As soon as I learned about your protocol and your research, I already knew the population of my people that I work with that they most likely fall into it because all of their symptoms, and we didn't even really talk of the 13 clusters and the symptoms like brain fog and just feeling unwell and really low energy and just sometimes joint pain. And I knew that they were the ones that were likely going to be susceptible to CIRS. If there was any marker to get tested, what would you, and let's say someone doesn't have a lot of money to do testing, what would be the one test, if there is any, that you would recommend other than the symptomology, other than the VCS test? What other test would you say you should get that one? Is there even one?
There's 3 answers. The first answer is VCS, and the symptoms cost $15 on site. Ours is reproducibly reliable. Careful what you see on the internet. So that's one thing. Secondly, TGF-Beta 1 is the pleiotropic multifactorial cytokine, can be pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. It raises more questions than what it answers. But the best test of all is Genie. Now, when you say you don't have a lot of money, Genie costs more than $750. Or that's how much it costs. It's very expensive. And I don't want you to be thinking about getting that. But the information you get is that you get the physiology, you get the metabolism there, you get the inflammatory stuff with cytokines and coagulation, you get brain injury. It's all in one package. So if you don't want to spend $1,000, spend $700.
Okay. And is that accessible to anyone, or do you have to go through a doctor or a certified CIRS practitioner?
It is now accessible to anyone. We have our CLIA application complete, so that we'd like to have doctors order it to get started. But at the same time, there are other people that are health related, such as yourself, who don't have an MD or a DO,
right,
or a nurse practitioner or a PA, who can order the test.
I'm just going back really quickly to the low amylose diet. So why do you recommend a low amylose diet for people?
Insulin is a pro-inflammatory hormone.
Okay.
If you avoid the foods that turn on insulin, you'll be on a no amylose diet. So that you need to use one of the pioglitazones back in the old days to lower MMP9 and VEGF. Now we just use omega-3 fish oils. But that's where if you are eating in amylose-containing foods or amylopectin-containing foods, you'll do poorly. Just as a plug for the website, survivingmold.com, it's where you can find a ton. There must be 1 million free pages. Right. You can read it in the afternoon if you want to, but that's a lot of reading. Progene DX is where you get Genie, but there is a ton of stuff. The certified physician section on Surviving Mold is free. Read it. You'll go through the protocol. You can read it 45 times if you want, but you'll also have a chance to read what is evidence-based medicine, which is important in its own right.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much information, and it's very, when you first get into this, there's so many letters and alphabets, and for the layperson that's sick, but I mean, it's very comprehensive, and it's something that I think people that are not well, and then once they get tested for CIRS, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that is the most powerful thing about this treatment. And so I'm grateful for all the research you've done for this, because I didn't know what to do with this population that is so sick that their immune system responds to everything. And now you've brought a light to this darkness. And so I thank you for that.
Well, you're very welcome. And there's more on the way. One of the things that I see on a daily basis is that when you don't have your health, what is the one thing that dominates every single day? How you would like it to be healthy again, how you'd like it if you didn't have a tremor again, how you'd like it if you didn't need to take prednisone again.
Right.
And then when you start getting your health back, how'd you like to have your brain back? How'd you like your brain back? We published that in 2017, Fixing Gray Matter Nuclear Atrophy. All this stuff is published and peer reviewed with the things that people want: health, thought, ability to love and care, not be in chronic pain every single day. These are basic human needs. I think they're human rights.
Right.
Some may argue with me, but the real issue is that they are obtainable now. And all you got to do is read. All you got to do is look in the literature. Surviving Mold, Protein DX. Be very careful on the internet.
Oh, I agree. Well, thank you so much for your time. I mean, this is just, I know, the beginning and scratching the surface of what all is CIRS, but I think it was so important for you to come on and share with this community that my guess is at least maybe 50% may be suffering from, because if they're willing to do a meat-only diet, they're obviously not doing well in some aspect. And I would not be surprised if it's the chronic inflammation. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you. And this was enjoyable for me. So I appreciate all your kind concern.
Thank you. Take care. I hope that you found this information helpful. I know the discussion was pretty technical, but it's a lot of information that I highly recommend looking into, especially if you are not getting better and you have been working with so many different people. Sometimes it can be a lot more root cause than just a diet, than just an organ imbalance, than just something smaller that practitioners work on a common day-to-day basis. I hope this gives you another lever to pull to possibly get you to root cause healing. Thanks for joining me today. Make sure to eat a lot of meat, take care of your bodies, because it is the only place you have to live. I will talk to you guys next week. Take care. Bye, guys.